Are we too sentimental about books? And by that I mean, are we too precious about the physical condition of the books that we read? Does it matter? They say you can't judge a book by its cover, but we all do, or at least I've never met anyone who doesn't. I've been thinking about this quite a lot. In fact, I think this all started several years ago when someone, and I'm pretty sure it was Anton Her. Anton, if you're watching this, let me know if this was you. Ages ago, I read a tweet from someone who took a really funny dig at our obsession with the physical quality of a book and said something like, if you love smelling a book or walking into a bookshop and smelling the air, you don't love literature, you have a kink. And that really got to me because I am guilty of that, but I also think it's absolutely hilarious. I'm sure it was Anton. Anyway, do we care too much about the physical quality of our books? Here I have 2 copies of Guards Guards by Terry Pratchett. This is a vintage paperback with the original cover art. It's absolutely gorgeous. The pages are all yellowed, it's scratched up, it's battered, it's beaten. It's been read a dozen times, and it's just lovely. My partner's had this for years and years and years, and I love to see it. I love to hold it. I love how loved it looks. And this is my copy of Guards Guards. It's one of the newer cloth-bound hardback editions. I've tried to keep it as nice as possible. When I read Guards Guards, I had 2 choices and I picked this one, but I did think, yeah, I'd rather read the one that's in the good condition, but at the same time, maybe I would keep it in a better condition if I read the battered paperback. I still read this. And I thought too much about it as if any of it matters, because when we talk about Guards Guards, we're going to talk about Pratchett's genius. We're going to talk about his character writing, his sense of humour, his world building, his satire and irony, and all the other wonderful things about him and the worlds and stories and characters he created. So what does it matter? Well, this has been infuriating me because I am an absolute walking contradiction when it comes to this stuff. I know it doesn't matter. I want to sit on my high horse and say it doesn't matter and look down on all the people who get too precious about the physical quality of their books and what covers they have and what they look like on the shelf, etc., etc. I want to be that person, but I'm not, or at least not entirely. I'm also the person who cares. Okay, take this for example. This is my copy of Iron Widow by Shiran Jejao. If you look closely, you might notice the title of the book is barely there. As I read this cover to cover, the title, which is embossed and in gold, rubbed away. I rubbed it away with my own hands as I was reading it. This has never happened to me before with a book, paperback or not. The plastic that coats the cover has also started to pull away. That happens quite a lot with paperbacks. I managed to keep the spine nicely unbent, so that's good. But it annoys me that the title of the book is just not there anymore. So I went online and a few weeks ago I bought a hardcover edition. I love this book so much, and now I have a hardcover that I'll probably never read because I'll reread the paperback and you can actually see the title. But it was advertised as used like new, but if you turn it on its side, the spine is sun bleached. Someone probably had this on their windowsill and you can see the difference. So now I have 2 imperfect physical copies of this book. A hardback with a perfect cover and a paperback with a perfect spine. If I think about screaming, I think about all the people in the world who are actually facing tragedy and adversity. I think about the homeless guy who sits outside of my local Tesco and I give him a quid every time I walk by, and I think I'm screaming over the fact that I have 2 copies of this book and neither of them are quite perfect. Oh my god. So, I turned to my patrons. The conversation came about naturally on my Patreon Discord server, and then I turned it into an official question to gather up a bunch of responses. And I'm going to tell you what my patrons have to say with regards to this conversation, this back and forth about whether or not we're too precious about our books, so that we can get a nice selection of voices and different opinions, different viewpoints, blah, blah, blah. If you'd like to be part of this conversation or ones like it, you can join my Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Every single patron gets access to the Discord, where we all talk about books and various other things. And I have lots of other tiers where people get access to things that I'm writing, poetry, short stories, a novel I'm working on, early access to videos, previews of videos, essays that I write about writing and reading and various other things. I put a lot into my Patreon, and I'd really love it if you'd support me. I live off Patreon. It is my main source of income, and I'd really appreciate your support. I put as much into my Patreon as I can to make sure my patrons get the rewards that they deserve for supporting me. So please do consider supporting me on Patreon. Now let's see what my patrons have to say about this topic, and it's pretty broad and interesting. To start it off, I told my patrons that I am, as I've said, a hypocrite. Anytime I walk into a used bookshop, I love seeing all of the damaged paperbacks with spines that have been cracked 5 times, corners that are weathered, pages that have been annotated and scribbled on. I absolutely love it. I find it so romantic. These books have been loved and carefully analysed, favourite passages underlined and highlighted, notes in the margins. They've been read again and again until they start disintegrating because they're made of paper. I find it beautiful, and I do see an intense romanticism in it. But when it comes to my own books, all the stuff behind me, I try to keep them absolutely perfect. I try not to crack the spines. I want the corners and the edges to stay nice and crisp. I rarely annotate them. I usually only annotate and fold over corners and highlight pages if it's non-fiction. Non-fiction books I'll annotate as much as I like. Fiction, I don't. I'm too precious about it. So I'm a hypocrite. And in response to that, my patrons said, well, let's start with Solus, who said that they are the exact opposite to me. They said, I like buying books in as good a condition as possible, and then I love seeing the life I give it. I underline my favourite lines, I take it everywhere with me, I often accidentally spill a drop of coffee, sometimes beer. I also write my name, the year, and the city where I purchased it. That way my bookshelf is also a journal of my travels. That's so lovely. I genuinely feel so influenced by this. I want to start doing that. In fact, I wish I had. I've got loads of books on my shelves that I bought in various places. Oh God, I wish I'd done that. It's a brilliant idea. Aspen James actually replied to that and said, I love it. We have a few books that made the rounds through different friend groups, mine and my kids. And we ask everybody who reads each one to sign the back page. That's so lovely. In their own separate comment, Aspen James also added, our favourite books are the most coffee stained, and they break open at our most reread sections. Oh, my 20-year-old and I were recently moving my spouse's favourite series from one bookcase to another, and almost every volume is in pieces. Not a euphemism, they are literally detached covers and book chunks held together by packaging tape, reinforced dust jackets, and nostalgia. My kids suggested we get new copies of the worst volumes as a surprise gift, and when we double-checked before hunting them all down, my spouse was like, but we're still keeping my copies, right? Oh, these people are so lovely. What a nice family. Oh my God, imagine having parents who read books. Emmy said, at this point, I get the vast majority of my books from the library, usually in ebook format. But as a kid, I remember lending one of my beloved Redwall books, not a series I'm familiar with, to a friend, and it came back looking like she dropped it in a puddle and stomped on it. But for some reason, my child brain thought that this was incredible, and I just thought it was really cool that when she read books, it was so obvious that they'd been read and used, whereas when I read one of my books, there was not really a visible difference. This reminds me of a similar story where I had just moved to Tokyo, and I read a very funny travel memoir about a guy who travelled around Japan by hitchhiking. It was a really fun book, and I lent it to a friend/colleague, and I'm not joking, she gave it back and it was orange. It was covered in, I'm sure, Cheeto dust. Absolutely caked in the stuff. I don't know how that's possible. I was angry and I couldn't see the funny side, even though now it's kind of a funny story. Leah said, I treat my books with respect and care, and I'm mostly careful not to spill things or rip them. But I also break the spine for comfort, underline and annotate and write down the dates of reading and rereading them. It shows my interactions with them, and I believe it'll be fun to revisit later in life. That's awesome! I like hearing all this stuff, and yet my brain is still like, no, I couldn't do that. Oh, I need to calm down. Endobiologist said, I believe that if a book is well worn, it means it's well loved. Yes, I agree. I do. I promise I do agree. A new book looks better, but a well-worn book has a badge of honor. Yes, I know. And yet, May J said, I buy a lot of books secondhand or get them from friends or family or from clearance sections, so I don't mind books getting a bit beaten up. I don't bend the spines or otherwise damage them on purpose, but if it happens, it doesn't bother me. All this is doing is making me feel too precious. Like, I asked the question at the beginning, are we too sentimental? Are we too precious? Clearly we are not. I am. I'm the problem. Haley said it depends on the book. I'm more careful with a nice hardback compared to a paperback. With some paperbacks it seems impossible to keep them in a good condition, so I'm less bothered about doing that. And this has just reminded me of, I think it was a tweet that I saw once. You remember that discourse a few years ago where there was that guy who like chops massive paperbacks in half so that they're easier to carry around and read? And Twitter blew up for like a month over this. That was a fun time. And I do remember one person who probably worked in publishing or was an author or something. They had a bit of authority. They said that that's the reason paperbacks are cheap. At least here in the UK. I know American paperbacks are more expensive, but paperbacks are affordable things. You'll spend 20 quid on a hardback, but like 9 quid on a paperback. Paperbacks are kind of disposable or repurchasable. You can afford to buy 2 or 3 copies to give to friends and family. I mean, not right now because we're all financially struggling so much, but the principle is there. Paperbacks are more cheaply made. If they get battered or lost, it's okay. Whereas hardbacks are more designed to be pretty. They sit on your shelf and look gorgeous. That's why my hardbacks are on the top shelf. Hardbacks look nice on a shelf. Paperbacks can get battered and it's not a great loss. You can get another one. Tyler Gray said it depends on the book. If it's someone else's, of course I'll treat it as carefully as possible. If it's my own, I have certain books that I'm careful with, special editions, but most of them I will write in them, annotate, crack the spine. Not on purpose, but it doesn't bother me. I'll dog-ear them, etc. I do want to keep my books in one piece, but I also love them looking read and loved. Sarah said no dog ears. I try not to crack the spines, but I end up doing it to so many books because a lot of books I read tend to be long and it's really hard to keep paperbacks open without breaking the spine. Yes, as I've said in a few videos recently, I've been getting back into fantasy. Fantasy books are really long and I have cracked every single spine. If a book is under 500 pages, it'll crack right down the middle as soon as you get to the halfway point. If it's like 600, 700, 800 pages, I usually end up cracking it between the acts. Like end of act 1, end of act 2, crack, crack. And I just realized now I don't care, I don't mind. Maybe I'm growing, probably not. Tina Hatch said, this is a really interesting conversation. I try not to outright abuse my books, but I annotate my paperbacks, especially non-fiction, same, and I'll even dog-ear the pages on occasion. Hardcovers are a different matter, mainly because most of my hardcovers were purchased because they're beautiful. I agree with Willow that there is such delight in browsing a used bookstore and thumbing through well-loved books. Yes, good, yes. Yeah. Hand gestures, yes. Ty says, I don't mind if I crack a spine a little as long as it doesn't make the pages loose. Yes, I once had, and I think this was like a production error, I had a copy of Hush, which is a Batman comic by Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale. Amazing Batman comic, really, really fun. And it fell apart after I read it. Like, the pages just started falling out, and it's kind of an issue with trade paperbacks of comic books. It does happen. They're not glued together very well, and Hush fell apart in my hands. Comics are expensive as well. That thing costs like 20 quid in paperback, and it just fell apart. I've never had a paperback actually fall apart, but comics do, and I'm still annoyed at that. That was like 15 years ago. I'm still angry. Eve Ballard says, I get a lot of books from secondhand stores and rare bookstores, so I have quite a few that are well worn. But when a book comes into my possession, whether secondhand or new, I try to keep them in as pristine condition as I can. I see my books as precious pockets of knowledge, so I try to treat them as such. Precious pockets of knowledge. I've been using precious all the way through this video in a very derogatory, self-deprecating kind of way, but they are precious and we can treat them as such. The idea of throwing a book away or burning it obviously has very, very terrible connotations. Ethically and morally, The idea of getting rid of, throwing out, burning a book, destroying a book. There are so many intense things wrong with it. I could do a whole rant about all the different ideas that crop up in my head when I think about destroying books. And yet, being overly precious and sentimental about books also feels bland and uninteresting, which I feel like I've been, and I want to break that. A book getting damaged by the love that we put into the physical act of reading is gorgeous. I don't want to just romanticize it anymore. I want to actually follow through with it and read a book until it starts to fall apart and not worry about the damage that that does. Now I feel kind of silly for buying a hardcover copy of this, because the fact that the title is gone shows that I loved it when I read it. It shows how aggressively I was reading this wonderful thing. When I look at or pick up one of my partner's many Terry Pratchett books, they're all like this. They're all battered and bruised and half held together. And they do smell great. Sorry, Anton, if it even was you. Oh God, it is lovely. Are we too precious about our books? Well, I definitely am. I could stand to be a lot less sentimental, especially when we consider the fact that a book looking well loved is in itself sentimental. Subscribe for books.